Good afternoon. It's an honor to welcome Professor Surinder S. Jodhka ji, who is an eminent sociologist and professor at JNU New Delhi. I think everybody knows who are connected online or offline. Um, I also welcome our teacher, former teacher, Professor Rajmohini Sethi ji. Despite she was very busy and she has a fracture in the hand, she is here with us. Thank you, madam, for coming. Um, I welcome Dr. J.S. Samraji, is also eminent personality with us. He was formerly with Niti Aayog, and before that he was with the Indian Council of Agriculture Research and doing a lot of good work for environmental conservation, sustainability in this region now, working with various organizations, including FAO and others. So, and I welcome all of you, those who have come from other institutes and our research scholars, and also those who are online. And it's really great honor that only 2 days back I requested Professor Jodhka on telephone that, sir, since you are in Chandigarh, kindly come visit CRRID and interact with our scholars and also with the student, with the faculty. And although he said that he will keep it little informal, but we made it very formal by creating an online link also. So many people are now connected online. So I request my young colleague, Ms. Chandrakala, who is a research scholar, uh, to introduce the chief guest, the guest speaker of today. On for this lecture. I think it's truly an honor to have you all here. And I also thank you, Professor Surinder Jodhka. We are deeply grateful to you, sir, for your time and you joined us today. And that too at very short notice. We are extremely glad to have you here. Before we all begin, I would like to share a brief introduction about Jodhka, sir. Although many of us are already aware of his distinguished work, Professor Jodhka is currently a faculty member at JNU New Delhi. His notable works are on inconsistent hierarchy, caste and agrarian change, and issues of rural India. His publication also include peasant movement. He has also published a handbook on rural India. He is also recipient of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientist and many other awards. He is on editorial board in of Sociological Bulletin and many other journals. He also published around 23 books and 120 articles. Once again, and I thank you, Professor Jodhka, for being here with us today. Without further delay, we will excited to begin with today's session on caste and equality. Inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are welcoming your grand teacher. Teacher.
Thank you, Manoj, for being so persuasive and also for inviting Mr. Sethi, who was also my colleague long time back here and also taught in the department where I studied, even though I didn't study in her class. I came here only to do PhD. So thank you so much. CRRID is something that we have always known. When I came to Chandigarh, CRRID was, in some sense, a new place, and we used to come here for various kinds of workshops and programs, and it was such a vibrant place. So Manoj is, as I said, is very persuasive, and he's been kind of asking me every 6 months, 1 year, he sent me an invitation. This time you must come, this time you must come. So I also feel very guilty. Somehow or the other one is kind of busy with various things, and I end up saying no. Last time, actually, when you invited, I was more or less ready to come, but there was something else that came up, and I had to kind of say no to it. So As the title suggests, I'm going to speak briefly on caste and inequality. As I said, as Manoj also said, that it was more like an informal discussion. And caste is a subject on which I've been working for many years now, for nearly 25 years. I've been working for a longer period than this, but my work on caste began actually while I was here in Chandigarh in 1999. I started with a kind of long survey of 51 villages on untouchability. And then after that, we continued to work on caste. We did a study of 6 villages. I also studied caste conflict in Punjab. And then I've also been at some level writing on caste. Given that we are teachers of sociology, one also is required to teach subjects like caste. That also helps us develop our perspective. So my perspective on caste has kind of evolved over time, and my latest publication of caste is the Oxford Handbook of Caste, which has writings of 46 or 47 scholars from all over the world who have written on different aspects of caste. So caste is a very big subject. Besides this, recently, 2 months back, we published another 2-volume set, which has been published by Springer, a global handbook of inequality, and I'm the chief editor of that set of 2 volumes, which has 87 chapters. 87 chapters is quite a lot of work. It's published in 2 big, heavy volumes. The weight itself is like 1 kg plus of the 2 books. So in that article, I have a chapter which is called Caste as/and Inequality. So when I was talking to him, I thought something, from that one could kind of talk about. But what I'm going to speak is not necessarily following the structure of the chapter. I also don't have a presentation. So as was agreed upon, it will be more like an informal gupshup, but it's more of a professional gupshup rather than a kind of informal, friendly gupshup. So the starting point, I think the way I talk about caste is that we need to kind of engage with caste, not thinking of caste as a reality which is out there. In sociology, we use the word sui generis. Most of the literature or most of the time when we talk about caste, we think of caste as being something out there, like there is this room or this table, and this table has a design, and this design is meant for a seminar room, conference room, where people can sit together, talk to each other with speakers in front of their mouth. So there is this tendency to also look at society or social realities as if they are social facts, like Immanuel Durkheim had talked about thinking of reality as sui generis. And my work has been, in some sense, trying to argue against those kinds of positions. I feel this kind of engagement or approach to social reality creates more problems than solutions. And social reality is something that is also being framed while we are speaking about it. It's also being produced while we are speaking about it. And not that things are not out there. They are there, but they are also, because we are talking about human subjects, we are talking about relationships. Human beings always have choices of working, thinking differently. And so it's kind of more closer to Weberian position rather than to Durkheimian position. So my starting point would be to look at how caste has come to be framed. Framing becomes very, very critical. Framing is, again, a kind of political act. It is not something that is already given. You can frame a small photograph into a big frame, even though there are constraints of it. But there's a lot of possible ways in which the same thing can be said or projected. So I think the dominant framing of caste, the way we talk about it in classrooms, and it starts sometime in the 19th century with the British colonial kind of framings of caste. Before that, to some extent, the European Orientalists and Indologists talk about caste when they're talking about India. So caste is very central to the way they frame India. And India is very central to the way they frame caste, right? One can think about caste as a system of inequality, a system of, as I describe it, I define it as as a structure of ascription-based hierarchies, but they do it differently. They do it as a Hindu religious institution, which is uniquely and exceptionally Indian and South Asian. And then in the process, we also, at some level, tie it with Hinduism, and in the process, you end up producing an imagination of Hinduism, which is very singular, that there is only one kind of Hinduism, which is inscribed in certain kind of texts, which is Brahmanic Hinduism. And anyone who is living in India, we know our religious life is very fluid and very kind of multi-terrain. And Hinduism itself is hard to define. And that is the beauty of Hinduism. There's not one single Hinduism. There are different devatas, different avatars, different texts. So Hinduism is not like Islam or Christianity. So the colonial or the West European engagement with India at some level starts with their own understanding of themselves, that religion is kind of Semitic religion with a text and with a kind of notion of God. So caste is implicated in that. But at the same time, colonial narrative is also a modernist narrative. When I say modernist narrative, modernist in the sense that what exists in India, what exists in caste society, it's a system which one could best describe as traditional society. And modern society is the kind of society that we have, that means the West has. And the Western society is urban, Western society is assumed to be associational collectives of individuals. And these associational collectives are voluntary, and these associational collectives could also be occupational collectives, which they would describe as class. And class is always fluid, while caste is structured based on your birth, based on your identity. So underlying this modern framing is also modernization narrative. What do I mean by modernization narrative? Modernization narrative is that caste has no choice but to change, but to become like class. So caste is seen as something which ought to change. And this is an imagination of India, imagination of caste, imagination also of India's possible futures. And this imagination becomes very, very, what one should say, influential, very, what one should say, foundational, to the extent that if you look at Indian nationalist movement or Indian national elite, they also accept this framing and they begin to, at some level, reproduce that framing in their own understanding of India. So when India becomes independent, people like Nehru or to some extent also Ambedkar, all of them are embedded in this modernist narrative on caste, that caste is essentially a traditional system and all traditional systems go away, caste would also go away. But then there is also radical criticism of caste, which comes from Ambedkar, that it is not only a traditional system, it is also a kind of power hierarchy and violent system, oppressive system, and it will not only go away, it ought to go away. So I kind of don't disagree with that framing at some level, but this is very important that caste, while this framing is the mainstream imagination of Indian nationalist movement, while this is also mainstream framing of what one would call as Indian modern common sense. I'm using the word modern common sense. Most of us who are sitting here, we are urban, we live in cities. And if any one of us was to say something on caste, we'll all repeat that narrative that caste is a bad thing, caste is traditional, caste should go away. But at the same time, when we go back in our personal lives, or even when we introduce ourselves in public, we almost all of us identify ourselves with the community that we come from. So it's a very interesting kind of paradox. One should not look at it as pretension. I think this is a kind of paradox with which the modern Indian lives, because our modernity is defined by somebody else. So we find that modernity alienating, but at the same time, that modernity has also become hegemonic. When I say hegemonic, I mean that we consent to that dominant narrative on the way we ought to be and the way we are. But at the same time, we also realize that, at the end of the day, what do I have? I have my family, I have my kinship, I have my name, I have my identity. And most of us are also very not only comfortable with those identities, but actually we are proud of those identities. And why not? So all of us have our own identities. Religion is also an identity. Gender is also an identity. Likewise, your kinship is also an identity. So identification with kinship is in some sense very natural and very understandable. But this identification also produces a kind of complicated social effects that almost unanimously urban middle class Indians would agree that caste should go away. And almost unanimously, we reproduce caste. I mean, 95%, 90 to 95% marriages in India are endogamous. And in some sense, also caste is not simply question of endogamy or question of ethnic identification with your kin. Caste is also about hierarchy. Caste is also about inequality. Caste is a structure which produces or which provides advantages and disadvantages. So when we talk about caste, we also are stuck to our caste because that is a source of our identity in a very positive manner. It is a resource for you, and you would want to kind of claim those titles. So caste is also a complicated reality because at some level, Indian economy and Indian emerging economy is also linked to who you are, and that in some sense, the mobility pathways also go through identities. And this is something which scholars working on mobilities are again and again emphasizing, that we in social stratification courses teach mobility as an individual process. If you work hard, if you are meritorious, if you are committed, all of us keep saying that to our own children, and you will achieve, you'll go very far. Many of us do individually, but not all of us do. And part of it also is the kind of identities that you have. So this is about talking about discrimination. Now, discrimination is very central to the idea of caste. Discrimination is subtle, but discrimination could also be structural, right? So there are some people who don't even have the choice of learning a language. For example, if you are growing up in an urban middle class locality, even if you are not very competent student, you'll grow up learning English language, and you grow up learning several other skills which have market value. And at the same time, if you are growing up in a Dalit locality, you grow up with many skills. You also grow up with lots of resources, but those resources and skills have no market value. So not that they don't have those skills are kind of valued very differently by society. And this whole structure of valuation is also caste, right? Caste is, again, not something that we choose. Caste is also something that's given to us. So this is, in a sense, the modern framing and modern narrative of caste, or contemporary framing and contemporary narrative of caste, where we recognize until 1960s or 70s, this narrative was primarily about caste ought to be forgotten. Right? The Nehruvian state, for example, initially did not visualize caste to be so robust an institution. They thought that it's just a matter of time. And I remember in 1960s and 70s, there were many sociologists who were writing about caste and class, caste to class. Has class already emerged? Is caste going down? Right? These were the kinds of questions that came directly from modernization theory, and people were also empirically working on it. But in the last 20 years, we have come to also recognize that caste is not only not going away, it was supposed to go away on its own with modernization, with urbanization, with other kinds of processes of change, but it is persisting, and it is persisting very actively, and that active persistence is made possible by the existing structures of social exclusion and discrimination. So these are actively reproduced systems where certain categories of people are kept out of the system. And that's why in the post-1990s, you have new categories like social exclusion. Category of exclusion did not exist earlier. It was after Amartya Sen wrote this essay for Asian Development Bank. Exclusion becomes part of development narrative. Likewise, discrimination, we know the word discrimination, but it becomes a subject matter in social sciences only in the last 20 years when some economists begin to kind of read American literature, economics, neoliberal, neoclassical literature on taste for discrimination, people like Becker, that they come to back to India and then they look at data that is there a kind of discrimination effect on wages and is identity shaping those. So by like the first decade of the 21st century, caste is increasingly beginning to be seen as a structure that discriminates against people. It's no longer a cultural system of traditions, cultural system that was hierarchical, but it also comes to be increasingly recognized as a structure that produces economic outcomes differently for different identities, not because of them being individual poor, as the poverty was initially defined. Poverty was not really defined on the basis of identities. Poverty was a household character, as we'll think of in survey, that the person is able to earn enough income without his identity or her identity. So, but in the early decades of 2020, 21st century, there is this move where we begin to account for identities when we are talking about poverty, when we are talking about inequalities and disparities, and their caste becomes a very significant factor. It's around this time, I think 11th five-year plan, that there is a separate chapter on caste in Planning Commission document. And so there is a recognition of caste as a structuring structure, as a structure that structures inequalities, that inequalities are not simply random household characters. They are also tied to certain identities. If you are Dalit, then your chances of being poor is much higher than if you are, say, quote unquote, an upper caste. Not only that, but even if you are not poor, but if you happen to be Dalit, that identity also represents a kind of site of deprivation. And this is where scholars like Pierre Bourdieu and their work comes to, at some level, reframe things like caste, where we begin to use the category of embodiment, that you carry with you in your person some kind of cultural and social capital. And those cultural and social capitals at some level make way for you in labor market, and mobility processes are not simply questions of individual merit and hard work. They are also produced and reproduced by the kind of cultural capital that you embody, the family you come from, the background you come from, the social habitats that you have grown in. So in some sense, in last 20 years, caste has come to be recognized. Earlier also, people, for example, Louis Dumas would talk about caste as system of ritual hierarchy. No, ritual hierarchy is not really inequality. Ritual hierarchy is something else. So caste was primarily seen as a traditional system which was to go away with the coming of modernity. But now increasingly caste is seen as a sticky structure, what is also described by this person as durable inequality, as some kind of durable inequality, which has ability to reproduce itself even when there is no cultural context in which it should be there. So that is one kind of system. But then there is another literature that comes out again in the it begins to come out in 1970s, late 60s. Already you have Rudolph and Rudolph publishing a book on tradition, modernity and tradition, or something like that. And this is literature on Indian democracy, right? And Indian democracy literature is produced largely by political scientists or political sociologists who say that caste is a structure of inequality. But if you look at democratic political process, it has the capacity to change caste into something else. And what is that something else? That something else is kind of ethnic formations where hierarchically structured communities can become horizontally different communities, right? So there is a kind of with electoral process, people mobilize their caste identities, but in the process of mobilizing caste identities, they also transform the reality of caste. Say, for example, if Mayawati is able to mobilize Dalits and Lalu Prasad Yadav is able to mobilize OBCs, they come together on the political center stage as groups which are at some level equal in terms of their ability to form government. So it's possible that in one time Mayawati will form government, at another time Samajwadi Party will form government, and third time it could be Congress or BJP, which may represent, say, the so-called upper castes. So this literature is very interesting because this kind of then progresses in sociology as well. I mean, Rajni Kothari again was very, very important. His contribution that when caste enters politics, caste also gets politicized. When caste gets politicized, then the internal social organization of caste changes. That internal social organization of caste is no longer patriarchal, it becomes associational. For example, if you have Brahmin Mahasabha, you will have to have an office bearer, it will have to have a constitution. So caste also transforms, the democratic politics transforms the internal grammar of caste. So caste comes to civic space of democracy as groupings which are facing each other as equal, not really as hierarchical. So no one is going to worry about the caste if the contender is a Brahmin, and if Dalit votes are more or Dalits can mobilize more votes, the person who mobilizes more votes will win. Brahmin has no entitlement to that position, so Brahmin's votes will be Brahmin's vote, and if they are only 10% or 30%, and Dalit votes are 35%, 40%, so the person who gets more votes wins and becomes the chief minister, becomes the MLA or MP, and then his or her power would prevail. So this is also at some level leveling effect of democracy. Again, this argument has been extended by sociologists. My colleague and friend Dipankar Gupta, for example, published a paper which was earlier a chapter of a book where he talks about that caste increasingly exists as an identity, and it doesn't exist as a structure of hierarchy, which was an interesting argument. And my work at some level contradicts both these positions, right? I argue that caste continues to exist and it reproduces itself as a system of inequality, and not as even if they become identities, even if they are facing each other politically, their inequality does not go away. Now, how does it come about? My argument was there was a paper published in Sociological Bulletin, I think 2006, where I talked about caste and democracy, and I reworked it for my book on caste in contemporary India. There is a chapter on that. There's also an article chapter in another book edited by Neerja Jayal and Pratap Bhanu Mehta on caste and politics or caste and democracy. So in these 4-5 places, I've written about it. And my argument is that it's easier said than done. So when you're talking about caste and democracy, for example, in the political process, the actual process is far more complex. You don't come to democratic politics with equal resources. It is always shaped by also your identity, right? And this was based on my empirical work in Punjab, that caste is not something that happens only at the state level. Caste and politics are played out even at the local level. And if you look at the local level caste conflicts, say, for example, in Punjab, we studied the case of Talhan. There was another case in Nawashahar district. There was another case in Malwa region. And all these villages had cases of Dalit assertion. And Dalits were, because of democracy, they were trying to make claims over resources that are common to the village, but they had hitherto been under the preserve of the dominant caste. For example, Panchayat land in the village. Panchayat land in the village is invariably in rural Punjab. Many of you would know about it. Earlier, Dalits would have quota on that Panchayat land, 25% or 30%, depending on the population. But the dominant caste person, in Punjab case, normally the Jats, landlords will pick up their own Siri and would get that land allotted on his name, but de facto ownership would remain with the landowner Jat. Likewise, in one village, there were common resources of the village, like village ponds, right? So Dalits had their own pond in that locality, and that pond was filled up. they wanted to build, they got some special grant from government of Punjab to build their own Panchayat Bhavan, which is a kind of community resource where they can organize their marriages, etc. And after they had built they filled their talab, their pond, they wanted their drain to go into another pond, which was seen as village pond, which was the biggest pond. Now the judge said, this is our pond. How dare you put your drain into our pond? And that led to major conflict. The third, obviously, was the case of Talhan. I don't know if you have heard about it, where there was a dargah, where there is a local religious site, which was not to begin with a gurudwara, which was a common place where one person from artisan caste died while they were digging the well, but then he was revered, and in his memory they built a samad, and the samad turned into a kind of proper huge place of worship. And after some time, they also constructed a small gurudwara next to it, and there was Guru Granth Sahib kept there. But the samad made a lot of money because there was annual mela organized there. And this samad was also managed by the village committee, but the village committee had only upper caste villagers, non-Dalits basically. The village population was such, and this is a this is the Doaba village, from where lots of Jats have migrated out. So over the years, village demographics has changed. Nearly 70% of the villagers living in the village were Dalits, right? Mostly Adharmis, Chamars, and stuff like that. And they realize that, Samad money comes, the funds come, and the committee decides to spend those funds on the village development. And when they think about village development, they don't think about Dalit locality. The road has to be built, if the toilets have to be built, everything happens in the Jat locality, or they have their own functions and parties with that money. We don't get any share. And they started demanding that we should also have representation in the committee that governs the Samad, because it's a village Samad. It's not really anybody's private property. And the Jats resisted it, and it led to serious conflict. It happened, I think, in 2001 or so. I published a paper in EPW, along with Prakash Lewis. So we had visited that. So these are three cases that I studied, and all of them reflected that if you look at the grammar of local conflict, it's very unequal. Right? Dalits would try to resist. There would be some violence. In some cases, things had changed. They had some contacts with local bureaucracy. They could make it into a political question. But at the end of the day, invariably, wherever you have conflict, there is some kind of a compromise, which at some level, which is very disadvantageous for Dalits. It's very rarely that it leads to a democratization of the village. None of the places in Talhan, for example, there was a compromise where the local bureaucracy made sure that a Dalit was made member of the committee. And I remember speaking to this person, and he said, yeah, who cares? I mean, I'm nominally member. Nobody asks me. When it actually decision-making happens, now I'm present there. The condition was that you should also be a proper Keshatari Sikh. He was very willing to be Keshatari Sikh because they were anyway Sikhs. Most of the Adharmis went to Gurudwaras, and the rituals were mostly like Sikhs. And he was very willing to become Sikh. But after having become Sikh and becoming member, majority remain with the Jats. So not that democracy doesn't do anything, but inequality of resources, which are independent of democratic politics, remains. So my argument was that one needs to have a differentiated view of caste and politics. And this differentiated view would take into account the kind of social, political, cultural, economic resources that you come with to the democratic political platform, right? We know the story of Mayawati, BSP. Apart from all other things, the question of resources is very, very central, all kinds of resources. And Mayawati was a phenomenon for some time, and my theory would suggest that she would get further and further marginalized in the UP politics. Another 10 years, perhaps BSP might exist in some form or the other, but it will have to then tie up with other kinds of alliances, alliance politics. Earlier also it was through alliance politics, but it was because of the shrewdness of Kashiram that they were able to make space. So democracy does open up political space, but inequalities persist because inequalities are not simply questions of representational numbers, or it's not simply a question of ritual hierarchy. Ritual hierarchy is one aspect of caste, but caste is also a material reality. And this is what I've argued in my recent paper, it has come out in EPW, on the futures of caste, which was also my Malcolm Adisheshaya lecture, that we need to look at the materialities of caste. The materialities of caste go far beyond the ritual realities of caste. Ritual realities of castes are very, very significant. Not that they're not significant, but even when you don't have Brahminism, like in case of Punjab, we don't have Brahminical Hinduism, right? We don't have Brahmin ritualism, but we know there is, anywhere you go in a village in Punjab, the first thing that you would encounter is caste. 98% perhaps agricultural land belongs to non-Dalits. I mean, Dalits are 32% of the population. Earlier they were 28%. At that time, I knew the number of Dalits who had agricultural land was very, very insignificant. They hardly had 2% or 3% of agricultural land. Now with Raisiks becoming SC, it might have gone up slightly because Raisiks have their own land, but it is still insignificant. And this happened because British colonial view of Indian society was shaped with their own notion, because Jats were seen as cultivators. When formalization was happening of land ownership rights, they not only gave all the land to Jats and some other non-Dalit castes, we also had what is called as Land Alienation Act of 1900 or 1901, where Dalits were identified as a non-agricultural caste. So not only they did not own land, they were not even allowed to buy land, right? So it's a very kind of, the caste is also part of the state system. And that fact is a structural fact. That fact is a structuring structure. So whatever mobility is, Duaba Chamars may claim that Put Chamara and all that. But when you go back to the village, those inequalities are very persistent and those inequalities are real. And these inequalities then also become a reality when there is a process of mobility out of village. So when you come out of village, initially there were some jobs available in the reserved category. Now those Sarkari jobs are becoming lesser and lesser. And this again is another work that I did, Dalits in business. So when they come to cities and they want to set up a business, urban business economy is also largely structured around caste all across the subcontinent, right? So any business you want to enter, you need an entry point. Unless you have a lot of resources, unless you have a lot of money, unless you can raise a bank loan, unless you have entrepreneurship, unless you have social networks. Now, all these things are not only not there with Dalits, they also don't have the ability to mobilize those resources. If you go to a bank, the first thing the bank will ask is what is there with you as surety? Do you have any friend who can come and certify your papers that yes, you will pay back money? Do you have 2 acres of land, papers that you can keep with us on the basis of which we can give you 50 lakh rupees loan? He doesn't have any of those. Even if they have, then when they go to ask somebody for a place from where they can run their business, they would encounter prejudice. It will be very difficult for them to get even a shop on rent in a decent area, because that area is dominated by a particular caste network. So I think I should stop now. I mean, there are other studies also we have done on corporate hiring where these things matter. So the point that I'm making is that pathways of mobilities are also not fair. Pathways of mobilities are also structured by pre-existing structures of hierarchy, pre-existing structures of disadvantage. And that's why caste continues to be a kind of axis of inequality, even when we are not living in a social order of caste.
Thank you very much, sir. That's a beautiful discourse on this important subject, and we have come to know very important issues, and how vectors of equality are also there through democratic space or through other processes. And maybe in due course, when we have some question answers, it'll be able to address some of the issues like how this many of these economists like Thomas Piketty or even Arvind Panagaria, when they talk about Panagaria in one of the articles, he says that poverty across the social groups, when he compared to NSSO surveys, he says that poverty is declined over a period of time, and it has benefited scheduled caste and OBCs, etc. And then Thomas Piketty says that inequality is growing in terms of resources and income and wealth. I think two dimensions he touch, income and resources. So how that those trends in your scheme of analysis, how that translate into and with the government interventions, they're trying to through direct benefit transfer or reservation policies or many other schemes and programs, how it is helping in that. So that will be one of the issue we can talk. But before that, I request Professor Sethi to give her remarks.
Well, thank you, Manoj, for asking me to speak. I was really very impressed with in a very lucid way, you explained the structure of caste from the 60s onwards till today. And before I came here, I was thinking that when in the 60s, we used to think, as you yourself started with the we used to think that in due course of time, because of modernization of Indian society, the castes would change into caste structure, would change into class structure, and we would be all represented by a class society in the future. But that has not happened. In fact, caste system has become more important in our lives today. And what are the factors that explain it? And one thing that I would like you to make it more clear to me is, why is every politician in India looking for caste-based vote banks? Is it because of the size of the population of those caste-based groups, or is it because of their discriminatory status in the caste hierarchy? Caste and class hierarchy, both, because we are all moving forward.
The response to the two questions.
You also,
Yes. I am of course not a sociologist, but I will share you the transition in my village. Our village, my village is near Kudustap, Taranta. There were two Majlis and then landowners. They have their own Gurdwara, we had our own Gurdwara, they had their own pond, we had our own. We used to hire them and used to give them 70 mands grain. Series. It was not in cash, but in kind. So we will give them 70 mands, 28 quintal nowadays per annum. And normally they used to continue with us 10 to 15 years or something like that. This was the system at that time. And then they were allowed to take fodder from their animals from us. Then in the evening, when they will go back, we used to give them some milk also for their children. Then if the person is working with me, there is a marriage of his children, then sugar we used to provide, then atta, and these are things that are kind.
Well known,
It was well good. And it was a very accommodative system. So much so that the person who has worked with us 20 years, and he said, I will continue to come to your house, sir. We even spared some fuel for him when he dies. So that, and that worked very well. There was no conflict. But this system has disappeared now.
Yeah, yeah.
Now the payment is now it's not we're not paying in grains.
Oh, I know that. Work on that. But what is your question for me?
My point is this transition is taking place, and I do not know how far it will further go, but some transition has already taken place.
Yeah,
Maybe that there will be more transitions also.
yeah. This is, I've studied this process.
Any question online you can ask? Maybe you can answer. Can answer this question and then we.
Yeah. You want to ask now or? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. These are, I think, all very important points. See, the question of economic disparities is one aspect of inequality. The handbook of Global Handbook of Inequality, the introductory chapter, where I've tried to argue that inequality is always symbolic. Right? Income disparity is a very critical aspect of inequality, but that's only one aspect of inequality. Economists tend to tend to kind of confuse poverty with inequality, inequalities of wealth with inequality. They're very important indicators, but that's only the entry point, right? Inequality also has to be symbolic. A good example of this is the difference between men and women and inequality of gender. The inequality of gender, in some sense, is in class terms, in terms of ownership of wealth, is flat, right? So husband and wife more or less would be equal in terms of their economic status, but they're still unequal, right? Likewise, when we are talking about inequality as social process, caste is an inequality as a social process, which would also have economic aspect, and economic aspects can change it, as I was trying to argue. So that's where embodiment becomes very, very critical. What kind of identities you have, they become very critical. So I don't have any problem with the Piketty or the other person, Panigrahi. They are both speaking using facts. And those facts are valid facts. When Piketty is saying that inequality in India has grown to an extent that it resembles the colonial period, which is empirically true. I mean, we have large wealth which is being concentrated, and inequality doesn't mean that the poverty has gone up. It can happen when poverty is declining, but inequality is growing. The poorest of the poor has more income because poverty is a kind of absolute process, while inequality is a relative process. So you can have more inequality and less poverty. So the both of them can be correct, right? But that doesn't really tell us about social inequalities. That again, positions of influence, symbolic positions of power may still be with certain kind of people who are likely to be men, who are likely to be people of certain caste community. Again, Professor Sethi's question is very this is something that I've been thinking about when I started working on caste and politics. This was the first answer that comes to that, caste exists because of the wily nature of our politicians. They are kind of so entrepreneurial and they're always so crooked. And they, in some sense, generate these vote blocks or vote banks. And in the process, castes get mobilized for political reasons, and then that creates social conflict. There is definitely an element of truth in that, given that we also have reservations, given that all those things they do obviously provide a ground. But at the same time, even if there was no such thing, there were no mobilization, caste would not go away. Caste is a structure, as I said, which is very deep-rooted. And in some sense, the political class was very smart. And political class reached there before social scientists reached there. And they are the ones who were enumerating communities. They are the ones. But if you look at successful democratic politics never becomes possible on the basis of caste mobilization of a single group. All big parties will have voters from all castes, right? Even Muslims will vote for BJP. They may be small numbers, but they would always be kind of sectors of, caste politics thing is overplayed, I feel. Yes, it works. It in some sense, these are social cohorts which politicians want to organize. Also, I've written paper on Kashiram and the making of Dalit political agency, where I've tried to argue how the question of hissedari, in some sense, brings in a new narrative of representation, and it is that narrative of representation that BJP is able to use a home minister and is able to mobilize Dalits and lower OBCs much more effectively than BSP is able to. And so that's another kind of process. But these are empirical processes. So we can make judgments, but at the same time, as social scientists, we also need to engage with them empirically. So that would be my kind of position. But there were also left politicians who did not want to do caste politics, and they became irrelevant. About the local level economic relations, and this is something on which a lot of work has been done. My PhD thesis was on debt dependencies, by the way. That was done in late 1980s. I've revisited that. In Punjab, they are called CRRIs. In Haryana, they are called Sajis. Before me, there was this person, Sheila Bhalla, who had worked on this system, and she actually said that these Sajis have now become knocker. Saji is a sharecropper, in some sense, sharer, and knocker is a servant. And then in other parts of the country also, Jan Bremen describes this process as process of depatronization, where there is formalization of relationship, that if you work with me for 2 days, I'll give you money. If you don't, then I won't give you anything. So their holidays are also, but that system has declined very radically. They don't want to work. They hate this system because you may think it is accommodative. You may think that this is something which is cooperative, but they see violence in it. Violence, not in literal sense of the term. They see that we have no say in it. I remember this attached laborer telling me, and I published it in 2 papers over a period of 22 years. And the first paper was first field work, second paper was after 20 years, and say that being an attached laborer or Saji or Siri is like being women of the employer on whose body he has complete control. So they hate that system, and they also see that if the labor relations are formalized, they stand to gain. So I work for 8 hours, this is the wage. If I work for 9 hours, you'll have to pay me 1 hour extra. Right? But if you are kind of being loyal and you take care of them, then you also make them work for 12 hours. So it's a power relationship, right? The other person is not equal to you. I mean, once you patronize them, so they hate patronage. And this is something that's a larger question.
Conflict, basically.
Yeah, so that's why, I mean, attached labor actually produced lots of conflicts in 1980s.
Yes.
That's how it began to decline. Yeah, there were other questions. Yes, please. Yeah, please go.
I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a justice lawyer. My question is around engagement, engagement cards. I'm glad you've been drawing parallels with inequality between men and women. Because when I was a law student, we had a festival outside. The teacher was drafting, and he corrected some words in the maths instead of giving girls. And that was the first time I encountered some form of inequality, and I stood up and I said, "Sir, that is a very inappropriate comment. The girls in this class are as smart, if not smarter than the boys in this class." So my question is basically, sorry, I'm very passionate. So my question is centered around Indian democracy as a general. And so you very beautifully answered the why of people engaging with the issue of caste. Clearly, it still persists. I use your the book in my lectures also for lawyers in transformation, like Roscoe Constance, lawyers and social engineers. So my question is, what would you identify as the relevant issues? Because we're living in like a woke nightmare, and everybody's talking, but nothing is getting done. So that's a what question. And then my question is, how do you engage? Like I'm a young individual with limited impact, but you're like a public intellectual of like higher reach. How can a younger person engage and contribute? Because I don't want to wait till like I've reached a certain stature. I want to do a little bit. I think you got it, and I think that's all I was able to convey. I have too much emotion in me right now.
What did you say is your name?
Rehmat. It means blessing.
Rehmat.
Rehmat.
Rehmat. Okay. Yeah. You can take another question. Yeah, there was. Proposal.
And this is sort of very correct. Very brief question, sir. Do you agree that caste-based political parties in India have a greater tendency to get lost into a family nomination? Thank you.
I'm Prakash from Government College, Chandigarh.
how the lower caste income and rent levels converging with the higher caste. It is at what rate you have an idea this has to across different castes and convergence and income levels.
Yeah.
So how caste and occupation impact intergenerational occupation?
सर मेरा जो सवाल है कि हम कास्ट डिस्क्रिमिनेशन की बात कर रहे हैं, एक अपर कास्ट और लोअर कास्ट के लिए, जो कि सामान्य तौर पर हम देखते हैं। और जब देश आजाद होता है तो हमें एक आइडेंटिटी मिलती है, जितनी भी शेड्यूल कास्ट के अंदर कास्ट आती है उन सबको एक शेड्यूल कास्ट का नाम मिलता है, जो कि उस कैटेगरी के अंदर आ जाता है। अब मेरा सवाल ये है कि 75 साल हो गए, हम उस सब की तो बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन व्हाट अबाउट द इंट्रा कास्ट डिस्क्रिमिनेशन, जो कि अभी भी चल रहा है, और इसको आप किस तरह से अगले 10 या 15 सालों में देखते हैं, जिसको कि कहीं ना कहीं मुझे लगता है कि इग्नोर किया गया है। इंट्रा कास्ट उससे ज्यादा मुश्किल है, क्योंकि इंटर कास्ट तो वो हो गया जहां एक
मैं समझ गया।
सोशलाइजेशन में बच्चे को मतलब समझाया गया कि आपने डिस्क्रिमिनेशन करना है।
समझ गया।
जिसके साथ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन हुआ है वो किसी के साथ आप डिस्क्रिमिनेशन कर रहा है, तो आप इस चीज को किस तरह से?
Yeah.
My question is, between caste and also religion, is that the religion out of the religion person like caste. So same in the national documentation as well. For example, in Punjab, like
Gulf country. Yeah.
racial pathways for
Okay, thank you very much. Been, Mehmet, sorry, I wish I knew the answer to your questions. These are existential questions. Every generation needs to find their own way. And the fact that you're sitting here, the fact that you're talking about the subject means that you're already doing something. You already found a way. And if you are satisfied, then your way is not really passionate enough. So I compliment you for being both passionate and not satisfied. If we are satisfied, then there is no problem, right? Then we die, right? So I think that's the way to go. And I completely kind of, these are difficult times. But again, these difficult times are also times which are challenging, and they require more imagination, more creative engagement. They are more challenging. That's what would kind of, at some level, difficult times are also very, very interesting times. And being interesting doesn't mean being good, but being interesting could also be very bad. So what is the relevant question? Of course, I mean, the relevant question for me is in simple language, democracy, right? Democracy in an expansive way, not in a limited political way. Democracy also would include equality of some kind. And I'm not a proponent of, communist kind of equality, but being human to each other, being respectable to each other, recognizing everybody's dignities. These are very elementary questions, and these are very easy to achieve questions at some level. If we have political will, we already have a democratic system, we have a constitutional democracy. Our given framework allows us to do that. But what we need is some kind of, and social and political will. It's not only the state, but also I think at social level, we are a very fragmented society. And caste is an evidence of that, but it doesn't stop at caste. Gender is also an equally important part. There are many other identities where we tend to kind of actively and happily discriminate in the street while, talking to young people or talking to very old people. So I think there is a kind of culture of being nice to each other. And this is not something that West teaches us. We have our own cultural traditions which would talk about these things. They are pre-colonial, they are much older, and they have plenty of material which at some level provides us with resources of thinking a life which is more human, and that would require some kind of equality as the starting point. If we don't have that, then obviously it's difficult. Yes, I completely agree with you. Caste-based politics is obviously likely to also reduce itself to a kinship-based, family-based politics, right? That's the obvious thing. Likewise, all regional parties have become actually, Indian democracy is going through a process where money has become very critical, and control over money, control over party funds becomes very critical. And invariably, that gets identified with the family at the helm of the affairs. In every region, there are one or two families which end up becoming custodians of that regional politics, that caste politics. Caste politics has also come up with regional politics. In North India, of course, we have the BSP and the RJD. But in South also, in Tamil Nadu, we know, in Karnataka, we know these parties have. So yes, there are problems with that, very serious problems, because these caste-based parties also don't have democratic cultures for running political parties, and that's a problem with all the political parties in the country. It's not confined only to the regional or caste-based parties. So that's a good question to ask, but I'm not satisfied with this answer. I think this needs more empirical work.
Counter to the basic ideology which would be there of the caste-based of removing the inequality of
I understand, but what I'm saying is that these are normative positions. I can say this is right, this is wrong. You can say this is right, this is wrong. But why does it happen? It's an empirical question. Why do people in the party allow this to happen? Right? So we have seen what is happening in Haryana Congress, for example. So there are other empirical processes, historical processes on which no research has been done by political scientists. I think this is something that needs to be also engaged with empirically, and then we would know what is the mechanism. We know a little bit about Akali Dal. I can tell you how Badals began to be the center of Akali politics, and this was basically accumulation of funds that are required for elections. So everyone becomes dependent on the family, and they are the ones who are. So this is how different stories need to be studied empirically. We still don't know how did it happen. For that, we need more empirical work. Passing judgments is easier. Having journalistic commentaries is very easier, but I think empirical processes have to be mapped over a period of time historically, right? Because Akali Party was a very democratic political party of Jathedars, and it was internally very interesting kind of political experiment. Lower caste income converging. Yeah, there is very good work on this now. This person who is in Isaac Bangalore, what is his name? He's been working on it. So Thorat has been working on it. There's plenty of data now. If you were to look at, there's a book which I was also part of, Blocked by Caste, which also has data. But EPW also has published Madheshwaran's work, Thorat's work. There are other people also, economists, who have been working on it. So, but that is again an economics empirical question. So in some cases it converges, some cases it doesn't converge, and they are showing it empirically that there is a problem of discrimination even at the lower level of wage, and it kind of goes with caste. Caste and occupation impact intergenerational mobility. Yes, of course. I mean, but again, it's not just occupation. If you were to actually look at caste profiles and occupational profiles, this has become common sense. We all think about caste as occupational group, but empirically that is not the case. All the priests among Hindus are likely to be the Brahmin, but only a small proportion, 2 or 3% of Brahmins would be priests. 95% plus Brahmins would be secular. All the attached laborers in Malwa region of Punjab are likely to be Dalits from Mazbi or Valmiki caste, but all the scavengers, village sweepers, they are likely to be from Valmikis and Mazbi castes, but 95% of them have always been agricultural laborers, right? Which is more of a secular occupation. And this is true across caste groups. Say, for example, we have this notion of Rajputs. How many of them are actually in defense, right? Very few, historically also. So this is a notional association, right? But it also, when you say identification with occupation, that also gives you status. So there's a status hierarchy of occupation. if you are tied up with scavenging occupation, you have a very low status in the larger society, that these are people who do this kind of work. Therefore, they are low status people. These are people who do leather work and they eat dead cattle's meat. So they are low people. So that is how it works in society. That's why when we are talking about caste, we also need to engage with cultural processes. It's not simply a question of economic occupation versus specialization. So like Ambedkar had put it very nicely, it's not division of labor, it is division of laborers, right? So that is a kind of far more complicated process. Side to press कर दो ना हो जाता है. Yeah. About international migration, and this is a very important question again. But what is happening is a very interesting work by an anthropologist from Harvard. Her name is Ajanta Subramaniam. It's called, what is the title of that book? Merit of Caste. Yeah. So she is actually talking about IIT engineers who passed out from Chennai and their life in Silicon Valley. And she is trying to argue that how this elite status travels from Chennai to all the way in Silicon Valley. So caste is getting internationalized. So like Kashiram says that, wherever Indians go, they take their caste along. So caste has now become a legal question in US. It's kind of trying to become a legal question in some states. I think 1 or 2 states have already recognized it. And this is among South Asians. Right? So international migrations doesn't really change caste unless there is kind of political process that also makes it possible.
Thank you, sir. Let me check if there is a question here. How Asha Laiju, how do you look at inequality faced by non-Sikh community in land ownership?
Well, I've already mentioned that. I mean, it's an important question to ask, and I've worked on it. There's a paper that came out recently in this journal called Religions, where I've kind of surveyed the entire literature on Sikh religion and contentions around caste. Again, it's not a religious question. One should make a distinction between caste question and religion question. Dalits do not own land in Punjab because historically the land titles were given to Jats by the British, and this is true also about Haryana and Pakistan, Punjab, where land titles were given to Muslims, to Jats or the cultivating castes, which were a few. And Land Alienation Act is also not a religious act. This was again for administrative reasons because British was recruiting certain caste groups in their army, and they were identified as martial communities. All Sikhs were not identified as martial communities. It was only certain caste groups among Hindus, among Muslims, among Sikhs who were identified as martial communities. And that had influence over British policy. And that's why they brought in this act, Land Alienation Act, so that there is no conflict in Punjab, which would create trouble for them. So there are various other processes, but the consequence is that in Punjab, the land is mostly owned by the Jat Sikhs, and Dalits are landless by and large, all of them. And that is also keeping the caste question alive in Punjab in a variety of different ways.
Thank you very much, sir. I think social inequality was already there. Now, economists say that income and wealth inequality is also growing. So, social plus economic inequality square is going to create, a lot of challenges for the policy makers. Some of our studies indicate that whatever work has been done for housing, particularly for the scheduled caste and other underprivileged sections, is helping them in social upliftment also. Not only just economic upliftment, because the quality of life improves, and the education levels, the health and hygiene, many things improve with that. So I think those kind of initiatives are needed to break this vicious cycle uh, of caste and inequality and all those kind of problems. So I'm very grateful, sir, that you came at very short notice and request, and I'm sure everybody has benefited with today's deliberations. I'm grateful to Professor Jodhka and Professor Sethi for sparing time, and also all of you, particularly the faculty from outside, Dr. Suchet, I can see, and I don't know names of some of the faculty members, but Dr. Prakasan and others, and our research scholars, Chandrakala, Aishwarya, Rehana. Dr. Gurinder is also our faculty colleague here, anthropologist, and Ajit, uh, two Amit. Where is another Amit? Yes, here. So thank you, everybody, for and those online for coming forward. And I'm also grateful to the president of Indian Sociological Society. I called her yesterday to organize this online, and she immediately agreed. And so a lot of people were there online who were attending it. And so RC-19 Urban Studies and Indian Sociological Society and CRRID. Our director is not here today, but she immediately supported the idea of having you. Somehow she is in Delhi. She has to go early morning today. Uh, but thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank everybody.